afternoon. So the lunch you ate this afternoon, do you know which farm it comes from, where it was grown, who grew it, who looked after it, who watered it, so that you could eat it? And within that is a long debate in our society about the lack of transformation in our agricultural industry. We've actually seen this sector very difficult to transform. Around the world, agriculture can be difficult to reform. Also led to big debates around the ownership of land and agricultural land. Wandile Sihlobo is the chief economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Wandile, good afternoon to you. You've been looking at this. Let me start with the sort of first point. Let me choose my words carefully. What kind of reform do you think we need in our agricultural sector? Where would we need to start?
Thanks for having me on, Stephen. I think where we need to start, Stephen, that path is clearly outlined on what we call the Agriculture and Agro-Processing Master Plan. What it essentially entails is outlining the areas and the commodities of growth across the country and saying what specifically can be done in the Eastern Cape, in KZN, in Limpopo, and all of the other provinces. And further outlining, of course, then those value chains that do have room for growth. But what's needed now is, of course, then for the private sector and the government sit down together and say, we have to begin implementing this plan that was co-created and launched sometime last year by both those parties, the government and the private sector.
There's certain things that agriculture can do which almost no other sector can do, and one of them is employ a large number of people. So, yes, the agriculture sector can make a lot of money, we can export a lot of food, that's important, but it'll employ a lot of people while doing that.
Can employ a lot of people, Stephen, and I think that we must be practical and appreciate the fact that a number of South Africans have not had the opportunities, perhaps maybe to further some of their studies, and the agricultural sector does offer the avenues for the entry-level employment, the time people to be able to progress and go to other jobs within the value chain. And it certainly has seen, Stephen, some improvement in jobs. If you think back in 2012, which was the launch of the National Development Plan. At the time, the people that were working in South Africa's agriculture were somewhere around about 700,000 people. Today, it's nearly a million people that are working in this sector, which means then that there are some positives that have been happening and more people coming into this sector. But there's still more room for people to come in the sector, provided that there are reforms in as far as bringing new land into production and, of course, then opening up avenues for investment and widening the agro-processing. All of those are avenues that could lead to anything closer to 1 million jobs, which the NDP had talked about. And I think that it can still be a reality.
You talk about agro-processing, and already we have big companies. I'm thinking of two main groups, really, that process food. And they sell almost everything, any kind of food you can just about imagine. What kind of investment, what kind of agri-processing industry could we actually have?
I think the first thing, Stephen, that we do need is really to say, in the land of about 2.5 million hectares that is sitting in the state hands, can we transfer that to carefully selected beneficiaries? By saying carefully selected, I mean people who are really going to be able to use that land in a productive way. And I think once you have done that, to say, okay, let's pair that with blended finance instrument, which the Land Bank has already launched a leg of that, and IDC is already participating on that, bring in other financial institutions and make sure that it has a wider reach. You may need also incubation in between to really assist in skilling up some of those folks that will be selected for that land. And I think once that part then is done, private sector partnerships are something else that will come organically, and some you can think about it commodity by commodity that will need to be advanced on that. The room for value addition is wide, Stephen. You can think about it from the livestock industry all the way on fruit as well as on grains. And I think, which is the point I was making earlier, that the master plan took an approach of what is called the commodity value chain, because there it was mapping up where those commodities can be grown and what value addition could be done. And I think that we do have ability, or we could have ability, to actually advance our agro-processing across almost all of our value chain. There is capacity to do that. And I think the private sector intervention could follow through once some certain fundamentals are done. There will also be a need for legislative work to be put in place, either around what we call Act 36 of 1947 in South Africa. That's the act that really administers the registration of certain medicines, registration of certain seeds and agrochemicals that are needed to boost productivity. These are things that do not need that much capital from the state, but once they are put in place, they open up room for private capital and increased participation. And as a result of that, more growth in rural South Africa and, of course, the jobs.
So government's got some things to do, the private sector's got some things to do. Do you get a sense that it's happening? Do you get a sense that actually people are doing what they should be doing? Are they moving quickly?
I mean, I put out a piece, Stephen, earlier today on both the Business Day and in Mail and Guardian, and well as in Daily Maverick. And the idea behind the essay was saying, look, we have this good plan, but we are not getting into the ground and actually implementing it. And I would put the blame on all of the parties, Stephen, because what had happened is we were hit by intense load shedding, and the private sector had to move on resolving that, and the government also moved on the crisis mode. So we've all almost been moving on crisis mode of solving problems by problem, which perhaps it was necessary to do that. But I do think that we need to realign our focus, both on the private sector and in government, and I would add there on labor, to say, okay, let's sequence the step of implementation. Because this master plan, Stephen, was not a document of government or of private sector. It was really co-created by all of the partners. And I think realigning our visions and our energy on it and really being determined about how we implement is something that would be useful. Because if we don't do that, then it will be very difficult for the next plan to actually find some seriousness and the energy to work on it, because now people will almost fall into this conundrum of thinking that we are creating more plans, but we don't do anything once those plans are on the table.
How important is transformation within all of this? And part of this is about access to land. You've spoken about what the state has and how it could make land available. The other is access to water. How difficult is access to water in this?
I think, Stephen, transformation is very important, but one almost look at it in two ways and saying, firstly, we all agree that the number of black farmers in South Africa's agriculture is fairly small, somewhere around about 10% in the commercial output that we see. But of course, value chains differ by on those levels. But I do think that there is room then to say, let's boost inclusion. But in addition to that, we have to focus on saying, how do we grow in totality the agricultural sector? Because when we consider the amount of resources that are underutilized in agriculture, on our side, we think that the gross value added of agriculture could expand by anything between 15 to 30%. So this is what then we would term as inclusive growth. So it's not only just bringing in the black farmers in the sector, it's bringing them in and almost growing the agricultural pie in the process. Water will be an important component of that, and financing is an important component of that. And I think these are all of the aspects that we had reflected on within that master plan. But we need to get back onto the table to say, let's work on the implementation of it.
Wandile Sihlobo, thank you, Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. Do appreciate the time.